Hey everyone, welcome to Locked On Lakers for Friday. Brian Kamenetsky, Andy Kamenetsky. The Lakers are hoping to make a big run after the All-Star break. They're going to need the new guys, DAngelo Russell, Jared Vanderbilt, and Malik Beasley to do it. We're going to do a deep dive on all three with Ben Beacon of Locked On Wolves. That's next.
You are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks to everyone for making Locked On Lakers your first listen of every day, Monday through Friday, no matter how or where you get your podcasts. It's always free. It's never behind a paywall. Locked On Lakers on YouTube is where you go to see the show and participate with 12,000 other subscribers. Really vibrant and active community over there. Thank you so much for everybody's support. Earlier in the week, Andy had a chance to catch up with Ben Beacon. He is the host of Locked On Wolves, where, of course, DAngelo Russell has been, but also Jared Vanderbilt and Malik Beasley. So it was a good chance to continue this deep dive that we've been trying to do into the new Lakers. It's a good chance to continue this deep dive that we've been doing into the new Lakers. And so here's Andy with Ben Beacon.
Were you surprised at all that the Wolves dealt Russell? I know he was in a walk year, but he was also having a really good season.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little surprised. It had been rumored for really a year, and the rumors kind of ramped up when Tim Connolly took over in the offseason. Obviously, Connolly did not sign him. He was a Gerson Rosas aggressive pursuit in free agency first when he signed in Golden State, and then the trade just immediately that next deadline. Rosas was, as you mentioned, the whole besties thing, right? The D'Lo Cat pairing. He wanted that pick and roll duo, pick and pop duo. So it immediately became possible that he was going to be traded by the new front office. But to your point on the season, yeah, I mean, D'Lo, he started out really slow. October and the first part of November were pretty brutal. And then he had a few weeks where he was fantastic. He had a couple more rough weeks, and then he'd been shooting the lights out really since Christmas time, the start of the first of the year. I had predicted on the show, I didn't think they'd trade him because he was playing so well. The team had finally started to stabilize a little. No Cat means you need more scoring, right? So I was a little surprised, but you mentioned the walk year also because of the way the contract lines out. The Wolves wouldn't have just gotten that cap space, so they would have let him walk for nothing. So I think that was the motivating factor is like, hey, we can get something for him, get a player that in Mike Conley, who isn't going to score, isn't going to want to try and score 19, 20 points a game, get something in exchange for D'Lo. And I think that was really the calculus more than anything else.
Yeah, and a guy that knows Rudy Gobert, because that fit is, especially with all the capital that was given up to bring in Gobert and also his salary, it's really important to find a way to get the most out of him, which yes. It helps to have somebody with the familiarity that Conley has with him. Mm-hmm. The experience with Russell in Minnesota, like, it seemed like from the outside looking in, at times he'd get hot. Like I said, this season he was sort of sneakily at his best, and I don't think necessarily was noticed because there was so much other stuff going on.
Yes.
But there were low points. The 2022 playoffs come to mind. How would you describe DAngelo's time as a Timberwolf, broadly speaking?
I'd say volatile is probably the first word that comes to mind, which is also how I would describe his playing style, or I guess his production more accurately. I think that there were certainly good moments, but I mean, the season they traded for him the deadline right before COVID hits, right? So he plays 12 games for the Wolves. They look pretty good, but Cat's not on the floor. I think he played one game with Karl-Anthony Towns right after the deadline. Cat gets a minor injury. COVID happens. The next year, of course, starts late. Right as they lead into the next season, Gerson Rosas gets fired. A lot of reasons behind that, but he gets fired. So now it's you get this weird season, and then mid-season, or actually, I guess it was the following offseason, because mid-season that year, Ryan Saunders gets fired, and then the following offseason, Rosas gets fired. So it was like he was brought in by Rosas to play with Towns, to play with Ryan Saunders, or for Ryan Saunders. Saunders and D'Lo never really meshed. Saunders gets fired. Finch and D'Lo never, like, there was a mutual respect there, I think, more so than D'Lo had for Ryan Saunders, and that was good. But he wasn't Chris Finch's type of point guard, I don't think, which is interesting considering that Finch was handpicked by Rosas, but there just seemed to be some tension there. And D'Lo, like, he certainly wasn't blameless. Like, there's a lot of, and this is a topic any Timberwolves fan would tell you, Karl Anthony Towns hasn't had the same head coach for more than a couple seasons at a time over like 8 years. So that's just the life of being a Timberwolves player. But for D'Lo, he's certainly not blameless because of the way he plays. And so he'll have these stretches where, you know, he's hardly playable, like the playoffs last year, defensively and offensively, where he's hunting his own shot, taking ill-advised shots in transition, whatever it is. And then this year it was more that he couldn't get the ball, was unwilling and or unable to get the ball to Rudy Gobert. And Rudy's a unique player. You touched on that, and that's a different topic, I think. But so I think that, but on the flip side of things, when D'Lo's playing really well, and Lakers fans, I think, know this, NBA fans know this, he's really good. Like, he can get a shot off from anywhere. He can score with the best of them, even if it's in his own kind of unique way. And what I've always said on Locked On Wolves is that D'Lo, like, his highs are really high, his lows are really low. He grades out to an above average point guard. I think he's a good player. I don't think he's going to get a max contract next time around, but I think he's an above average point guard. It's just the volatility is something that the Wolves, I think, really kind of grew a little bit tired of.
Yeah, you know, I want to get to some of the stylistic stuff with D'Lo on both sides of the ball in a second, but you mentioned the tensions with Chris Finch and the tensions with Brian Saunders. There have been whispers about chemistry between him and Gobert in particular, though, to be fair, Gobert has been rumored to rub a lot of teammates the wrong way over the years. Had you heard that he's either difficult to coach or that he's difficult to mesh in a locker room, anything like that?
Not really. And that's what's so weird, is because the two head coaches he had in Minnesota, there was something there, but it was always kind of like they just didn't quite see eye to eye. And I never heard anything about D'Lo being a bad teammate until the recent Rudy stuff after D'Lo had left town. You know, people were saying that he could be heard kind of openly, you know, griping about how Rudy can't catch his bounce passes and stuff like that. So no, I mean, like, the players all seem to really like D'Lo, and even just today, Austin Rivers said at shoot around something about how D'Lo is a great player and Mike Conley is a great player, and sometimes you just need a change of scenery, and you know, we hope the best for D'Lo, and and I don't think that's just lip service. I think people genuinely like playing with him. The problem was his lows were so low that, and it felt like it at that moment in time, like whenever he was really struggling, it just it just seemed this way, right, from the outside looking in, that he just kind of, I don't want to say shut down, but like, it was just, he thought he'd try and shoot his way out of it. And then, like, you know, Finch wasn't afraid to bench him as he did in the playoffs last year against the Grizzlies. And he obviously didn't really respond well to that. And D'Lo's a really interesting character. And I think Wolves fans would say the same, because of the highs and lows, right? He never had the rep of like, he's a coach killer or anything like that. I mean, there's a lot of reasons Brian Saunders was fired, but he's just a very unique player. It was pretty interesting watching him over, you know, 2.5 seasons, I guess, in Minnesota.
Yeah. The Lakers, as far as on the court, the Lakers are a team that have been at their best this season in transition. And DAngelo has always been like a much more measured, probing, methodical type of point guard. The flip side is the Lakers really need to get better in the half court and find better options. How, from what you've seen, does he do in transition? And also, how are the ways that you think he can help them in the half court?
So I think one of the issues between Finch and D'Lo is that DAngelo Russell prefers to slow things down. He prefers to kind of take his time, and he would kind of hit, like, one of the more frustrating things about D'Lo, in my opinion, and I surmising this based on Chris Finch's reactions on the bench and some of, reading between the lines, was that the Wolves would be ready to run and it would be D'Lo, and then he'd wait for his teammates to catch up, and then he'd still launch a long three kind of in the secondary break, and there's 0 passes in the half court, right? That type of a play, I think, is what really rubbed Finch the wrong way, because Finch wants to play fast. This team, I think, finished the year first in pace last season, the Timberwolves did. And this year they've been top 10 most of the year, but they were kind of like 8, 9 for a while there. And that's not how Chris Finch wants to play. That said, DAngelo Russell's he still is a really good pick and roll point guard. Like, he's better shooting out of the pick and roll than Mike Conley is. Like, there's things he's really, really good at in the half court. The decision-making isn't quite what you'd want it to be out of a point guard. The passing skill is absolutely there. And I think everybody's seen that. He's a very skilled passer, but I think he didn't always pick his spots in the best way. And I think that was kind of his thing in the half court, but he's so good in pick and roll. He was very good with Cat, and even still, like, he and Karl-Anthony Towns never had more than a couple dozen games in a row together because of injuries last year to both of them. Really, I mean, D'Lo only played 65 games last year. COVID, like, they never really got as long of a shot as I think the Wolves wanted to see from them. But he's still a very good pick and roll guard. I think in transition, he's good. The one thing that is an issue both in transition and in the half court is he doesn't really like going to the basket. And we saw a little bit more out of that from him this year than we had the past couple of years. He doesn't draw a ton of fouls. He doesn't shoot a ton of free throws. He's a good free throw shooter when he gets to the line, but he would much rather shoot that kind of mid-range fall away. And so that's the spot he's trying to get to. So teams that play drop coverage, he could beat that. He's again a good passer, but it's picking his spots. Sometimes he kind of gets locked in and, okay, I'm going to shoot this pull up three. And, he's far from the only player that does that. But I think that's when he's in that, kind of the downhill side of the D'Lo roller coaster. We see a little bit more of that.
When we come back, I want to talk about DAngelo's defense and then get into Jared Vanderbilt and Malik Beasley, who you saw a few seasons worth with the Wolves as well. They've been something of a package traveling deal together, going team to team. So, and the Lakers are the latest spot. So we will talk about that coming up next. Locked On Lakers is brought to you by Nissan, and Nissan's most electric player of the week is brought to you by the all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya, and the award goes to DAngelo Russell, whose return to LA has been electric with its effect on the offense. Unlike his predecessor as the team's secondary playmaker and designated third scorer, who will, by the way, remain nameless. You can decide for yourself who I am referring to. There's an elegance to the way DAngelo Russell navigates in space, the way he probes in the lane. There's a beauty in the way he goes about his business, but also he is stunningly powerful in the way that he will surprise you with how he can absorb contact, put a defender on his hip, and there's a fierceness to his spirit. The dude just wants to win, and also too wants to get paid. He's got a contract coming up, and he's playing in a way right now that is going to make the Lakers have to make a difficult choice in the best kind of way. The 2023 Nissan Ariya packs pin you to your seat power and premium intelligence all in one EV. The all-new, all-electric 2023 Nissan Ariya, the EV for people who love to drive. Shop now at nissanusa.com. How good of a defender do you think Russell can be, particularly on a team that has aspirations to try to do something?
Yeah, I actually think that his defensive issues at times can be oversold. Like last year, I would argue, and I think a lot of the defensive metrics that attempt to kind of quantify individual defense kind of back this up. D'Lo last year was actually pretty decent defensively, which is, not great, but it's a lot better than what he had been, right? Like, certainly in Golden State, his half season there, he was really bad defensively in the first part of his time in Minnesota. And I don't know what exactly changed. Now last year, the Wolves played their pick and roll coverage was a high wall blitzing pick and roll, and D'Lo, that was in part, primarily to hide the deficiencies of D'Lo and Cat, but also to highlight what Jared Vanderbilt's good at, which we'll get to in a minute. To just be aggressive on the perimeter, and D'Lo has the size to do that. You're right. He's a below average athlete for an NBA player, but he has great size. He's a very intelligent player. Like he gets smart. Yeah, he's very smart. He understands timing, spacing, angles, like where he's supposed to be. And that's, I think, what's so maddening and why so many teams, they know he's smart. They know he's big. They know he's talented offensively. The defensive effort isn't always there. And also the limited athleticism. There was a game really near the end of his tenure in Minnesota where it was late in the game, and now I'm forgetting who it was even against. It might've been Utah, actually. Late in the game, the Wolves had made a furious comeback. It was close. D'Lo's guarding whoever he's supposed to be guarding. They're cutting baseline. He's pointing to, I think it was Kyle Anderson, who he's switching with, like, hey, you take him. And then, like, he just kind of doesn't pay attention, and there's a back cut and a dunk, and that's the end of the game, basically. And then after the play, he's kind of pointing, like, it's just kind of those plays where the communication isn't quite there, and then the effort appears to be lacking, and maybe it's just the communication, and you don't really know, but, like, it was almost one game a year this season where he would take a baseline cutter from the corner that he just would never turn his head, and he'd get beat on a back cut. Those types of things. And then also on-ball defense, again, not fully locking in, not getting into a stance, some of those things. But for much of last season, he was passable defensively. Like I really thought, I mean, the Wolves had a middle-of-the-pack defense with DAngelo Russell and Karl-Anthony Towns and no Rudy Gobert. I think it was, I don't think people realize the Wolves defense was actually pretty decent last year, and Vanderbilt was a big part of that. But D'Lo can be average. The problem is that he doesn't do it consistently. And so you get that volatility again, maybe a little less than you get it on offense. But I truly believe he can be an average on-ball defender. It's just how many games is he actually going to play at that level for you?
Jared Vanderbilt, moving on to him and Beasley, is somebody that, if nothing else, does not want to be a defensive liability, seems really focused on that end. How much versatility do you see in him? Like I've heard him, David Locke was actually just on with us doing a preview from his perspective in Utah, and he cautiously described Vanderbilt as somebody who could guard 1 through 5. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, I think comfortably it's 3 through 5 and some 1s and 2s is probably how I've described it on the show in the past. There were times last year the Wolves did ask him, like the first time last season when Vanderbilt became a regular player, it was like the 3rd or 4th game of the season. He hadn't even been in the rotation the first 2 games. And I believe Chris Finch started him against the Bucks and said, hey, go guard Giannis. And it turned out as you may expect, but it went okay, at least to start. And Vanderbilt clearly has the athleticism and obviously the length and the attitude you need to take that kind of assignment. I think the lateral quickness can be exploited when he guards quick 1s and 2s. But he can hold his own. Sorry, what was that?
That's a lot of the league.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I think in a pinch, he can do it because he's passable, right? Like he can do it in a pinch. He can guard 1 through 5. You can switch with him and you can be okay with it, right? And that's a huge thing to have, especially when he's really good against more mobile 3s and 4s. Like he can lock in 1-on-1. He can switch and pick and roll. He's not a traditional rim protector, obviously, but steals were kind of a big thing for him in Minnesota. He was a huge part of that blitzing defense. I mean, you look at his steal rate over the years. I mean, last year, actually the last 2 years in Minnesota, his steal rate was incredible. And that's that length. It's the intelligence. It's the athleticism. So I wouldn't put him on an island against most 1s and 2s, but he can do it. You could switch him defensively and feel pretty good about it.
What about Beasley defensively? Because I know, for example, a lot of Laker fans have been calling for a backcourt of DAngelo Russell and Malik Beasley. Over the long term, it doesn't strike me as a viable backcourt, but you've seen the two of them work together more than I have. What's your thought on it?
In hindsight, I should have looked up the Beasley and D'Lo 2-man numbers with the Wolves, but
why didn't you do more work then?
Yeah, I know. Where's the prep?
Who's doing who a favor, Ben?
They didn't really like. I guess Beasley did start for stretches, but last year he primarily came off the bench. I think they tried to avoid the backcourt of the two of them together because Beasley's on-ball defense, like obviously got the athleticism. He's super athletic. But it's not consistent. And honestly, I think he's a worse on-ball defender than DAngelo Russell because he doesn't typically he's guarding bigger players than D'Lo. He doesn't have that size advantage that D'Lo does. And I don't know that I don't want to say the intelligence isn't there, but the basketball IQ doesn't seem to be quite as high for Beasley defensively, at least. And he's got some of the same, I think, desire issues on that end of the floor. Beasley, what he's about, and you've probably already seen this in a couple games, is when he's on the floor, he's trying to get out in transition and get a transition 3. And he's fantastic at it. I would say he's, I mean, maybe hyperbole, but he's probably a top 10 transition 3-point shooter in the league. He's really good in that role. He barely touches the ball and it's, he's shooting it. That's what he does. He doesn't handle the ball in the half court really. So defensively, I think it's kind of a means to an end. Like I got to get back on offense, get out in transition. And that's kind of what's going through his mind all the time. He's very dynamic in transition. He's good getting to the basket in transition, but defensively is by far his biggest issue. If he could defend, I mean, he's a starter in this league. He's that good on offense in transition and running off screens and just kind of as a spot up shooter.
Yeah, I was going to ask with Beasley, everybody knows about the shooting and he's somebody with legit gravity and, takes him at a volume that you have to pay attention to him. What else is in his bag offensively? Like in terms of what he does beyond the outside shooting?
That's it. It's transition and it's outside shooting. But I think it's important to point out he's really good in transition because he's so athletic.
Right.
And it's funny, and I don't know if it's like he very rarely puts the ball on the floor in the half court. Like if he touches it, it's going towards the rim. And so the Wolves ran obviously a ton of plays to try and get pinned down and try and get him open for threes. But in transition, if you look at his points per possession in transition over the past, well, really his career going back to when he was in Denver, really, really good. Like he whether it's spot up threes or getting to the basket, he can finish because of his athleticism. But in the half court, it's really 3-pointers is what he does. You're not initiating and pick and roll with him. He's not running any offense. Like when guys were hurt last season in Minnesota, when D'Lo was hurt and you're down to just Jordan McLaughlin. It was Jalen Noel. It wasn't Malik Beasley initiating offense. So you want to run some plays for him to get some open threes. You want him to get out in transition and run. And he's really, really good at both those things, but that's kind of his limit.
No, I mean, it's a valuable skill.
Yes.
Lakers fans saw that with KCP the few years he was with there. His ability to run the floor in transition, fan out to the corners. It was a big part of what made their offense work. Vanderbilt, how much offense, if at all, can he create for himself? And the reason I ask that is just because we've seen the confidence that he has taking the ball in the open court, like ripping down a rebound. We've seen more of it, frankly, already in the first couple games he's been with the Lakers than I expected.
He's got a good handle. And he can, there was some talk when he came out of Kentucky, he had a really injury shortened season. His 1 year there, he was a 2nd round pick by, I forget who drafted him, but he was traded for by Denver on draft night a few years ago. There was talk that he could be like a point forward type because he can dribble. He's actually a pretty good passer when given the opportunity. Yeah. The problem is he can't shoot. It's like less than 5% of his shot attempts came from outside 10 feet the last couple of years in Minnesota, literally, and well under 5. I think it's like 3 or 4% of his shots. He doesn't shoot the ball outside the paint. He doesn't have great hands. That was probably the biggest thing that Wolves fans lamented, and kind of one of the things I kept saying over the offseason after the Gobert trade was, people worry about Gobert's hands, but it's going to be better than Vanderbilt. And if you're plugging Gobert in the Vanderbilt role, you're improving offensively and defensively. In general, that's kind of the bottom line. And of course, hasn't been quite that seamless because of everything else that comes with Gobert. But when it comes to Vanderbilt, it's pick and roll, and it's put him in the dunker spot is pretty much what the Wolves did. And then what ended up happening is teams would kind of leave him and say, we dare you to complete a lob to Vando, and he'd get a couple a game, and there would probably be one pass a game that bounces off his hands out of bounds or to the other team. But he's active. He's a good screener. He's just
really active.
He's very active on both ends of the floor. He's a good cutter too. So if the problem is if you play 5 out, no one's guarding him on the perimeter. But if you forget about him, he's a smart player. He's a good cutter. He knows where to be and when, and similar defensively, he's all over the place. His nickname in Minnesota, the broadcasters always called him V8 because of the activity level. And frankly, that's what the Wolves are missing right now. No Vanderbilt, no Patrick Beverley. There's a little bit of energy that is missing from the Wolves, and Vando was a huge part of that last year.
And then last question I have for you. The Lakers obviously are trying to make this push to get themselves in the play-in mix, maybe the playoff mix, and they're looking for these 3 guys to be a big part of making that happen. You've seen all 3 of them up close for a while. Do you think that they can be a difference maker in this quest for the Lakers?
I think yes. I think Beasley and Vanderbilt are 2 pretty perfect role players for almost any team because of all the skills we talked about. Beasley's an elite, movement shooter, an elite transition scorer. Vanderbilt is an elite energy player and a very good defender. Those are skill sets that you need in role players. And it's, I think Wolves fans have noticed that lacking this year with the replacement players. You raise the level of your best players in Minnesota, but the players in the rotation now, Jalen Noel isn't quite what Malik Beasley was, right? It's clear that there's a little bit of a gap there. And so I think they raised the floor of the Lakers, frankly. And D'Lo, again, it's the volatility. If he gets hot, if he gets comfortable, if he feels comfortable with his role there, borderline all-star D'Lo that we had in Brooklyn and for parts of this year and last year, even in Minnesota, that next to LeBron is scary. And then you add in a couple of good role players. I know Wolves fans looking at the standings and realizing hey, the Wolves are currently 2 games out of 4th place, but they're also 2 games out of 11th place. I think everybody in the West feels like the Lakers got better, and Wolves fans certainly feel that way. So yeah, to answer your question, I do think that they make the Lakers better. I think the Lakers improved. And I think Beasley and Vando are going to do their thing. I think they're going to fit in. To me, it's a question of if D'Lo is going to be a good soldier and understand, like, hey, like, I feel like he knows he's playing for an extension, but he's also, at the moment, he's a free agent this summer. So he also may be looking for his too. And so that would be my one thing is how does he actually play out the rest of this year? And is it in the best interest of the Lakers? If it is, I think the Lakers got a lot better.
Ben Beacon covers all things Timberwolves for Locked On Wolves. Make him your second listen after, obviously, you make Locked On Lakers your first. Really appreciate the time, man. Great stuff. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Locked On Lakers brought to you by Built Bar. Looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want all the fat and calories? That's me right there. I'm all fat and calories. If you want to eat a little bit healthier, like I really am trying to do, but you don't want to compromise taste, I got the thing for you. You got to try Built. With Built, healthy is actually tasty. I'm not kidding. They're so delicious, and you won't even think they're good for you. And they're perfect for any New Year's resolutions that you're still got working on here. And what makes them so good? Well, for starters, it's covered in 100% real chocolate. They are each one of them covered in 100% real chocolate and in great flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. I don't know how they do it, but the bars taste like candy while maintaining macros. They're only 130 calories, Andy, with 4 grams of sugar and 17 grams of protein. You used to have to wait to like order a box and have them delivered to you. And that's how we've been telling you to get it done over there at built.com. But now you can get them at your local Walmart or your local Sam's Club. You run in, you grab a 13-bar box with our hit flavors, brownie. You can thank me later. It's Built Bars. They're the best. Okay, so that was really informative. It was cool to get Ben's perspective too on these guys right after getting David's, because it gets to one of the things that I think is so important when you talk about role players and how they're used. You asked him why he thinks the Lakers have improved through these trades, and he pointed not necessarily to their ceiling but their floor. He said, this raises the floor for the Lakers. And I think that what you're getting at, Andy, about having, 9 or 10 deep, and you can argue, how many minutes would that guy play on the Nuggets? But the point is, they're all people you could look at and say belong in an NBA rotation in some way, shape, or form. That means your downside is more limited. And there have been so many games this year where, maybe LeBron and AD aren't quite at their most elite level. Somebody else is missing or something like that, where the floor of this team was just too low to compete. And you'd see these long stretches of really bad play. And I'm not saying that's not going to happen. I mean, it happens with really good teams even sometimes, but it should happen less often now with the Lakers because the floor is higher than it used to be. The ceiling, we'll see. I don't know if they're going to get to I don't think they'll be able to maximize their ceiling because there's not enough time. It could bump it up, should bump it up some, but just bumping up the floor could be worth, 1 or 2 games for them down the stretch. And 1 or 2 games over the last 23, I believe it is, could be the difference between 11 and, 9.
Yeah, it's just going to be fascinating, I think, to see what happens with DAngelo Russell during this period of, reacclimating himself with the organization that originally drafted him. But also, too, Rob Pelinka has talked about not seeing Russell as a stopgap measure, that he's somebody that could have a future with this team. And that's the way they've envisioned him. And we've talked about this before, Brian. He's not a perfect fit in terms of what you would want alongside LeBron and AD, just in the sense that defensively, you would want somebody who is somewhere between neutral and plus. And DAngelo has spent most of his career, I think, being considered somewhere between neutral and minus. But offensively, he's pretty close to perfect in terms of what you would put alongside LeBron and AD, in terms of the spacing that he provides, in terms of the secondary playmaking that he can provide, but also having utility off ball, not just somebody that can space the floor, but somebody who actually just moves without the ball. Like, he is somebody that I think LeBron and AD
can find use for, like, as a safety valve, just in the way that he doesn't stay in perpetual motion. Like he keeps defenses occupied.
But what I thought was really fascinating about listening to Ben talk about Russell and his time in Minnesota was like when he used the word volatile and went through the highs and lows and the ups and the downs and all that stuff, it sounded like how you would talk about the Russell Westbrook era in terms of like highs and lows and inconsistency and all. Now, it's not the same thing because it's a totally different kind of inconsistency. It's a different kind of play. It's a different kind of fit. It's all that kind of stuff. But it's another reminder of how all of these things can be really relative. Like your volatility over there, your swings in performance would be a welcome change to what we've been having over here, because it's not that Westbrook was, up and down or this, that. A lot of guys are. It's that even when he was up, it still didn't fit. And when it was down, it was even worse. Russell won't have that problem. When he's not playing well, he'll at least still be a fit within what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I'm going to be really watching for either reports or just signs, vibes, however you want to put it, of how Russell seems to deal with getting coached and how he and Darvin Ham seem to interact, because there's been a thread in D'Lo's career of, I don't want to say, Ben even mentioned this, like the idea of him being a coach killer is inaccurate and too strong. Luke Walton got fired well after DAngelo Russell was gone. The stuff going on in Minnesota was much bigger than DAngelo Russell himself, but the idea of the ability to coach him. And one of the things that I think can be interesting with this is, and this was something we picked up on being around DAngelo Russell. We were around that team a lot, the kids era. DAngelo's a really smart guy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's a really bright guy. And even early in his career with the Lakers, where you could see a lot of immaturity. Like, we used to say all the time that Julius Randle was a very old 19 and DAngelo Russell was a very young 19.
Mm-hmm.
And DAngelo used to talk about how when he went to Ohio State, he did not picture himself as a one and done. He had said that he had unpacked his bags expecting to stay, and then his stock rose in ways that, like, Julius Randle or Brandon Ingram, those guys knew they were one and dones. Like, they were on that lottery path.
Yeah.
And there's a certain amount of maturity that Randle and Ingram entered the league with that DAngelo didn't have, but the intelligence was always there. But sometimes being smart can make you tougher to coach. Rajon Rondo's been that way. Like, Rondo is a super smart guy. Super smart guys tend to think they have everything figured out, and sometimes can be more difficult to guide. And I'm going to be watching for those signs, because I've always liked DAngelo's game. And, when we covered him, I actually liked him personally. But, the Lakers are looking to try, it seems like, to try to actually build a team moving forward. He could be a legitimate piece for that, and, something that can address a lot of issues that they have.
It's kind of important that it work out, because let's say they plan on holding on to Vanderbilt and they decide to keep Malik Beasley, whether that's by exercising the option that they have on him for next year or declining that option, but re-signing him to a 3-year deal worth a little bit less money on an annual basis, however they decide to do it. If they do that, if they keep Rui Hachimura, if they keep Austin, there's not like they have $20 million or $22 million lying around to go get somebody who is in that talent slot that DAngelo is in. So if he doesn't, it really helps the Lakers if he works out and they feel comfortable giving him 3 and 65 or whatever the number turns out to be, something like that, because they're not going to, unless they kind of clear the decks completely, which is not a great option, I think, and not the outcome anybody wants. They won't be able to replace somebody like him. And so it is important. Locked On Lakers on YouTube is where you can go to see the show and engage with the crowd that's over there, and we engage with us because we try to participate as much as possible as well. I do want to let people know that our plan, Andy, correct, is to give ourselves a little bit of an all-star break by taking Sunday into Monday off. So we'll record a show for Tuesday after the holiday. Enjoy the all-star game, and we'll be back. We got a Mo Bamba. Andy, you alluded to it earlier. We got a Mo Bamba preview coming up. So a lot of good stuff getting into as we get through the all-star break and head into the final stretch run of the season. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll see you on Tuesday.